Dr. Valerie M. Hudson is Professor and George H.W. Bush Chair in the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, where she directs the program on women, peace, and security. She has previously taught at Brigham Young, Northwestern, and Rutgers universities. Her research foci include foreign policy analysis, security studies, gender and international relations, and methodology. She is the author or editor of several books, including, with Andrea Den Boer, Bare Branches: The Security Implications of Asia's Surplus Male Population, which won the American Association of Publishers Award for the Best Book in Political Science and the Otis Dudley Duncan Award for Best Book in Social Demography, resulting in feature stories in the New York Times, The Economist, 60 Minutes, and other news publications. Hudson was named to the list of Foreign Policy magazine's top 100 global thinkers for 2009, and in 2015 was recognized as Distinguished Scholar of Foreign Policy Analysis, and awarded an inaugural Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, as well as an inaugural Fulbright Distinguished Chair in the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at Australian National University. She served as the Director of Graduate Studies for the David M. Kennedy Center for International and Area Studies for 8 years, and served as Vice President of the International Studies Association from 2011 to 2012. Dr. Hudson is one of the principal investigators of the WomanStats Project, which includes the largest compilation of data on the status of women in the world today. She is also a founding editorial board member of Foreign Policy Analysis and a current or former editorial board member of Politics and Gender, the American Political Science Review, and the International Studies Review. She has testified 3 times before the House Foreign Affairs Committee and has assisted the National Intelligence Council in preparing its 2017 Global Trends Paradox of Progress report. Her book, Sex and World Peace, co-authored, yeah, it's a great book, I've read it, co-authored with Bonnie Baliff Spanville, Mary Caprioli, and Chad Emmett, and published by Columbia University Press, was listed by Gloria Steinem in 2014 as one of the top 3 books on her Reading Our Way to the Revolution list. Dr. Hudson's most recent book with Patricia Ladle, also from Columbia University Press, is entitled The Hillary Doctrine: Sex in American Foreign Policy. Her latest book project is The First Political Order: Sex, Governance, and National Security. Dr. Hudson is a founder and editorial board member of the online LDS journal Square 2, the president of the Utah Valley Institute of Cystic Fibrosis. She served in the 11th Special Forces U.S. Army Reserve as a wheeled vehicle and power generator mechanic, and has been a La Leche League leader for 31 years. She is married to David Kassler and is the mother of 8 children. Dr. Hudson will now speak to us on the Realpolitik, Sex, Governance, and Security, or Women, Peace, and Security. Dr. Hudson.
Thank you. Oh, I'm so excited to be here. And look at all those happy, smiling faces. That makes me very, very happy. Yeah, I couldn't help. I usually don't put in that last bit when I do presentations, but you know, I thought at BYU I could at least say that maybe I was one of the only people who had served in the Special Forces and was a breastfeeding counselor. So you know, you got to go with what you got. So I'm really thrilled to talk today. Can you see that? Is that too bright a light on there? Can we get the lights to be a little bit off on the front? Well, this is actually a national security talk. And yet, I think you will discover that it has a lot to do with women and what's going on with women. And it is the culmination of 4 years of work that we did for the U.S. Department of Defense. They gave us, they gave us almost $1.5 million, which was very interesting that they were willing to spend that much money to have a comprehensive overview of the links of how what's going on with women and what's going on with national security interrelate. All right, so being as this is quote unquote a security lecture, let's start off with the notion of Realpolitik. And those of you who've studied international relations know this is probably the dominant strand of thinking about national security. those of you who are helping me out here, instead of having my slide here at the front, I now have a picture of me at the front, which doesn't help me as much. Do you think you could turn it back to my slides so I won't have to go like that? But I'll do that if necessary. All right. So what is this Realpolitik? What is this realism that dominates national security discourse? Well, way back in 1853, Ludwig von Rochow stated it was the study of forces that shape, maintain, and alter the state. That is the basis of all political insight. In other words, Realpolitik is a study of how the world works in reality, not a study of how the world should be, but how it could be given what we know about how the world really works. It's practical, it's not ideological. And of course, if you're a student of international relations, you know it was very much at odds, right, with the notion that the nations of the world could band together and outlaw war, as they attempted to do with the Kellogg-Briand Pact back in the early days of the last century. So the major tenets are that states seek their national interest, which at a minimum includes physical security, economic sufficiency, and a world order conducive to both those interests. So, the question I would like to address today is whether the women, peace, and security agenda is a repudiation of Realpolitik or a confirmation of it. More specifically, I would like to ask if you are a realist, or are you a realist if you support the women, peace, and security agenda? And the answer that I would very much like to impart to you today is yes, okay? You are a realist, and you can only be a realist if, in fact, you understand the validity of the women, peace, and security agenda. Okay, I'm back to having a picture of me in the front again, so if we could change it back to the slide, I'd be really thrilled. All right, so what is women, peace, and security? All right, I am not sure that those who are here for the national security part of my talk have been taught it. And I am also not sure that those who are in the global women's issues classes have been taught the women, peace, and security agenda. So let me just give you the 101 on that. All right, and that is that in the year 2000, very appropriate for a new century and a new millennium, UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was promulgated. And it has many follow-on resolutions, as is the UN way of doing things. And basically, it suggested that women play a vital role in attempting to create peace within their societies, in attempting to rebuild their societies after conflict, and in helping to prevent their societies from moving to conflict. And so it called for things such as women should be at the. I think you normally know that the way you get to a peace table is by killing the most amount of your countrymen, right? That's how you earn a place at the peace table. So UN Security Council Resolution 1325 said, don't women deserve to be at that table? After all, it's their loved ones that you have killed. It's their homes that you have destroyed, right? Why is it that the people who have done the destruction deserve a place at the table, but not the people who picked up the pieces after the destruction? UNSCR 1325 also mandated that the nations of the world create national action plans for women, peace, and security, and the U.S., among 60 other nations, also has its own national action plan, first put forward in 2012 and renewed in 2016. More recently, last fall, just about exactly a year ago, the U.S. Congress passed the Women Peace Act of 2017, which makes the National Action Plan law. So it's not just an executive order anymore, it is law. And that mandates budgeting and reporting and monitoring and evaluation of the U.S. National Action Plan that we otherwise would not have. So the question for us is all of this just politically correct hype, right? Is this ideology perverting and intruding upon a realistic understanding of international affairs? Okay, let's see. There we go. All right. Well, I think it's beginning to be recognized that there might be something to it. So Don Steinberg, a friend of mine, formerly the deputy administrator of USAID, he said in 2015 when we brought him out to Texas A&M, compare those societies that respect women and those which don't. Who's trafficking in weapons and drugs? Who's harboring terrorists and starting pandemics? Whose problems require U.S. troops on the ground? There's a one-to-one correspondence. Don't tell me there's no relationship between national security and the empowerment of women. So we're also starting to get research findings that echo what Steinberg is saying. So for example, at the macro level of analysis, consider that studies have shown that women's subordination is significantly linked to the propensity to be involved in intra and interstate conflict, the propensity to use violence first in such a clash, and the propensity to break treaty obligations and flout international norms. And that corresponds with brand new micro-level analyses that show in cross-national surveys that individuals who hold more highly gender unequal beliefs and attitudes are also more significantly hostile to, as well as to minority groups within their own country. So taking all this together, a sort of a dawning awareness within the policy community as represented by Steinberg, as well as the macro level and the micro level analyses that are starting to come out, we asked ourselves, for the Department of Defense's sake, why would this be so? So we suggest that what's going on is that the first political order in any society is the sexual political order. It is the character of that first order, the character of the relations between men and women who constitute approximately half of the population each, that molds the society, its governance, and its behavior. Just think, I often tell my students, pretend you're in a video game class, and the only parameter I've given you to start a game is that there are two groups, neither of which can reproduce without the other. That is, the future literally depends on their interaction. So what kinds of choices are you going to have to make for that video game? The choices you're going to have to make are very political in nature. Let's look at them. First of all, you're going to have to decide the status of these two groups in the context of their difference. Will these two groups engage each other as equals or as subordinate and superordinate? And you can imagine a range, right? Your choices or societal choices along a spectrum. There will be societies that code these two groups as unequals, and you'll also have other societies that code them more as equals, right? Second dimension that is very political, decision-making in the context of difference. Will decisions in the society be made by one group or by both groups? And again, we can imagine a continuum where there are societies where decisions are made more by one group and others where they're made more by both. A third dimension, conflict resolution. If the two groups disagree, how is that conflict to be resolved? Will it be violent coercion of one group by the other? Or will it be nonviolent resolution based on coming to a consensus? And last, the fourth political dimension, resource distributive difference. With regard to these two groups, right, how are resources necessary for survival and persistence to be allocated? Will the resources be controlled more by one group, or will it be controlled more by both groups? So you see, my dear students, that the character of male-female relations is fundamentally political. How a society decides that those two halves are to relate to each other establishes what we are calling the first political order. And a crucial conversation that brought this home to me actually took place, about 13 years now, when I was still at BYU. We were hosting a group of female MPs from Afghanistan. And I was part of the hosting party, and we were at lunch, and I was assigned to a specific MP to make her feel welcome. And we were talking at lunch, and I was gushing about how incredible it was that here she was, a university-educated Afghan woman, and that she was now a member of parliament and what this meant for the future of Afghan women and their emancipation. And she stopped me and she said, Valerie, you don't understand. I could go home today and my husband could say, I divorce you 3 times, and I'd be divorced. And I would not have custody of my children because custody automatically goes to the father. And she said, if I was divorced, I would have nowhere to live, right? My parents would not take me in. I could not live on my own, and I could not live with my husband. And she said, lastly, even if I'm not divorced, I will have virtually no say in when my children are married or to whom they are married. So she said, Valerie, how liberated am I? How liberated am I really? And that's when I understood that we were looking for our understanding of women's status in a society in places that were perhaps not the best. So, yes, while it is very important to look at things like female literacy, female labor force participation, female parliamentary representation, I suggest to you that on the basis of nation, the first political order is established at the level of the household, and that's where the real action is, for good or for ill. So, for example, we would want to know answers to questions such as, how much say does a woman have about getting married? How old is she when she's married? How much say does a woman have after she's married, within her marriage? What types of property and inheritance rights do women have? Are there inequities in family law, such as in matters of divorce and child custody? Patrilocal, are bride price or dowry paid? Is polygyny or cousin marriage prevalent? Does the society view domestic violence and femicide as normal, even expected? Is rape treated as a property crime against a woman's father or husband? Right? This, right, is where you're going to see the first political order. And that's where we need to look in order to understand what I would consider to be the roots of national security or insecurity. So, being an empiricist, as I am, we organized an 11-component index of how subordinated women were at the household level. In other words, a gauge or a way to gauge that first political order within a society. And you can see that it creates kind of a circle that feeds upon itself, right? Starting in the upper left-hand side, if males are willing to violently coerce females, remember those 4 dimensions we were talking about? And that progresses to males controlling access to resources, with women lacking the ability to control resources such as property. When males control resources, then patrilocal marriage develops, where brides move to their husband's family's compound. And patrilocal marriage engenders patrilineality, where the true members of the family are the males, but where women move out of their patriline as they marry. Breeding, son preference. After all, if the true member of your family is your son and not your daughter, you're going to invest much more in the son than you will in the daughter. This also leads to a low age of marriage for girls. If she's not really your family, and if you're feeding and clothing her, and maybe even sending her to school, this is a burden that should be assumed as soon as possible by her husband's family. So you'll see a depression in the age of marriage of girls, leading overall to a deep inequity in family law and custom and personal status law and custom, which we see. And then we see 2 variants. If women's labor is valuable, such as we see in sub-Saharan Africa, you will develop what we call a bride price / polygyny culture, where a groom will have to pay a father to marry his daughter, and where rich men will accumulate quite a number of wives, because if women's labor is productive, then these wives then become the laborers for the family, and rich men are able to garner more resources if they marry more wives. If women's labor is not valuable, you'll see what we call dowry sex ratio alteration societies, such as we see in India, where it is in fact the father of the bride that must pay the groom's family for the marriage to occur. And as a result, most families believe that the birth of daughters is a catastrophe. And so you begin to see sex ratio alterations where through female infanticide or sex-selective abortion, girls are culled from the birth population. So here's those list of 11 variables that we operationalized into an index of female subordination, of a very subordinative first political order. All right, and if we mapped it, I don't think the map would surprise you very much, right? Where we have a number of nations where this syndrome, right, that circular syndrome is very, very present even in contemporary days. We also have other societies that are somewhat mitigated, such as China and other places where there's legacies of the syndrome that are still operational, and other societies where the syndrome is not very present at all. Okay, so given that this syndrome, very, very striking, is almost a universal characteristic of human society across space and time, and components of that 11-point index can be found in almost every civilization in human history, we ask ourselves, why? Why is this so universal? Why is the type of family law that you found in ancient China very much like the type of family law that you found among the ancient Aztecs? Right? Why is this so common and so universal? And we have proposed, right, that there's a very good and security-related reason for this. And that, in fact, what we are seeing is that the subordination of women is seen as a security provision mechanism, as necessary for the group, or at least seen as necessary by the males of the group to preserve security. Let's go through this for a minute. We believe that the most ancient security provision mechanism among human beings is the male kinship alliance. Creating that alliance, creating that fraternity solved the cooperation dilemma among men. Creating male alliances that are capable of offsetting external and internal threats becomes the key for the group to be secure. And this is most directly and most easily created, this fraternity, if there is blood relationship, okay? So a father, his sons, his brothers, their sons, the cousins, as an extended male kinship alliance. However, you cannot maintain these kind of fraternal alliances without practices that subjugate women's interests to those of the fraternity, all right? You are going to have to ensure that males control all the property, that males make all the decisions, that females marry out but sons stay in. Right? You're going to have to ensure that female interests are subordinated to the interest that is creating your security. However, what I'm going to show you in this talk is that governance by extended male kin networks leads to unfortunate consequences for the group. Instability, violence, corruption, autocracy. Why? Because it's built on a founding template, right, of male-female relations that instantiates instability, violence, corruption, autocracy, right? That the society you get will mirror the society that you have established at the household level. And if you're trying to think of examples of this, be thinking Afghanistan, be thinking South Sudan, be thinking about the stability profile of those countries where the male extended kin network is the foundational security provision mechanism. All right. This, I'm not even going to attempt. All I will do is suggest to you that this inner black circle is the one that you saw before and contains our 11 variables. And what we did is we took each of those variables and we asked ourselves, what would be the consequences for the country? So what would be the political consequences? What would be the health consequences? What would be the consequences for food security and economic security, health, demography, you name it. In other words, we began to make our hypotheses about what kinds of outcomes would be associated with the subordination of women. All right, So, DOD paid us about $1.5 million to collect all this data and to link it to these variables. And that's exactly what we did. So we used as our cutoff rho as less than or equal to 0.001. And we did that purposefully. In social science, the usual cutoff for statistical significance is 0.05, sometimes even 0.10. But we knew if we used those conventional cutoffs, people would still say, we're sure it must be something else. So we chose 0.001 as an extremely stringent standard almost never seen in social sciences outside of laboratory experiments. And we searched for outcome indicators across 9 dimensions of national security, and this is what we found. So across 23 measures of political instability, so we were not cherry picking, we looked at all that we could, the most determinant and significant predictor of national stability was our syndrome measure of how subordinated women were at the household level. 93% of those model runs found syndrome to be significant. Across 36 measures of conflict and insecurity, again, the most significant and determinative predictor was the syndrome, 65% of model runs. Across a subset of 6 measures of political terror, once again, the syndrome was the most significant and determinant measure. My capstone project last year actually looked at a database of 80 nations and looked at the comparative production of foreign fighters for ISIS. And they also found that whether your country produces terrorists or not is strongly dependent on the syndrome. Okay? Remember those links we talked about, how holding gender unequal beliefs makes it easier for you to hate those who are different than you and to use violence against those who are different than you. I can keep going. 22 measures of economic performance, 64% of model runs, syndrome was the most determinative. 32 measures of public health, 11 measures of environmental preservation. Turns out if you subordinate women, you're also subordinating those who perhaps may be the most incentivized to take care of the environment. Demographic security, okay? Much higher fertility, youth, risk factor rates when women are subordinated. 11 measures of educational attainment, social progress. So across all the model runs, over 100 model runs, the syndrome was significantly related at the 0.00 level in 68.4%. Okay, so let me re-ask that question. Are you a realist if you believe the treatment of women affects the security, stability, governance, resilience, health, wealth, demography, education, and social progress of a nation? Yes, you are. You are a realist. Are you a realist if you believe the women, peace, and security agenda is absolutely in the national interest? Yes. And more importantly, can you call yourself a realist if you don't? And my answer would be, no, you cannot. Okay? All right. We also calculated odds ratios, just so you know. If your nation highly encodes the syndrome, your nation has 2.3 times the chance of being a fragile state, 3.3 times the chance of having a government that's autocratic, less effective, and more corrupt, 1.57 the chance of being unstable and violent, 1.28 times the chance of experiencing terrorism, 1.4 times the chance of your country being poor and in economic decline, 1.5 times the chance of having a low GDP per capita, 1.55 times the chance of having low environmental quality, 1.92 times the chance of having a high fertility rate, 1.83 times the chance of having a higher incidence of preventable deaths, and 1.8 times the chance of scoring worse on the Global Hunger Index. It is almost, my dear students, as if when you choose to subordinate women, you have chosen to literally curse your nation. Does that have national security ramifications? Yes, I believe it does. How? How does household disempowerment contribute to instability, insecurity, and conflict? I believe there's three major reasons it does. First of all, the subordination of women at the household level is a boot camp. There is no better training camp for political violence and instability than lived domestic terror perpetration, lived domestic corruption and exploitation, lived domestic autocracy. You are training the young boys and girls in your society to accept autocracy, to view terror as functional, to view corruption as a way of life. Secondly, the syndrome also creates chronic structural goads for engaging in political violence. As we'll see in a minute, inflationary bride price, prevalent polygyny, sex ratio alteration, actually incentivizes young men to join rebel and terrorist groups. And lastly, what the subordination of women does is it disempowers women. That is, you're disempowering the very individuals whose influence could profoundly change the calculus of political violence within a society. So these are the linkages as we see it. So a couple of examples here, and I'm not going to spend very much time on this because we have to get to Q&A, but bride price. What we have found that societies that have bride price usually have inflationary bubbles of bride price. And what we discover is that rebel and terrorist groups use that inflationary bubble as a way to recruit young men into their groups. And as you can see, bride price is not an old-fashioned institution. Bride price actually exists in about half the world, and in fact, encompasses about 75% of the world's population. Boko Haram is an example where a huge jump in bride price in northern Nigeria in the 2000s was used to recruit young men. One young woman who was captured said, "In this crisis, these men can take a wife at no extra charge. Usually it's very expensive to take a wife, very hard to get married, but not now." And in our case studies, we found very similar dynamics in South Sudan and Pakistan also. A more longer-term structural goad can be seen in the increasing masculinization of the world's population. The male-female global sex ratio is now over 101.4. So women are no longer half of humanity. They no longer hold up half the sky. And this is not due to some plague or natural disaster. This is entirely man-made. In 1990, when I first started sex ratios, there were only five nations that had abnormal birth sex ratios. And some of those were appendages of China, right, such as Hong Kong. But now there are 19, including Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, China, Egypt, Fiji, Georgia, India, Kosovo, Kuwait, Lebanon, Montenegro, the Philippines, South Sudan, Taiwan, Macedonia, Vanuatu, Vietnam. So the things that we're talking about, practices of the ancient world, these are practices that are resurging as nations such as Armenia and Albania, feeling lots of insecurity, turn once more to the ancient security mechanisms of male kinship alliances, clans, tribes, and in so doing, re-subordinate women in order to create those alliances. It's also true that masculine migrant flows are causing sex ratio alterations even in countries that don't subordinate women. So, for example, in 2015, Sweden opened its doors to migration. And well over 80% of those who migrated into Sweden that year were male. And almost all of them claimed to be 16 or 17 years old because under Swedish law, no migrant under 18 can be deported for any reason. They've since changed the law. But what happened in that 1 year, right, in 2016, you ended up with a sex ratio among 16 and 17-year-olds in Sweden that was far worse than the sex ratio in China. So, for example, in China, it was only 117 young men per 100 young women. In Sweden, it was 123 young men per 100 young women. So you can even get these kinds of effects in non-syndrome nations as well. All right, I'm not going to go through that. The reservoir. Can male kinship alliances as a security provision resurge? Yes, they can. And I think we saw its resurgence during the Arab quote-unquote spring, which turned out to be an Arab winter for women. And I believe there's at least two reservoirs that make it easy for this to come back. One of those is high levels of violence against women worldwide, right? So, yeah, in Afghanistan, it's much worse but in Sweden, you still have 1 in 5 women who experience domestic violence. And secondly, there are legacies of inequitable and personal status law that favor males in terms of property rights, rights in marriage, and women as legal minors that still exist in countries that you would consider to be more developed. Let me give you an example. In Russia, a woman can be a sailor. She is forbidden by law from being a ship's captain, right? Interesting little legacies there are. All right, the takeaway from our book is what changes in national security when we become realists? So I'll read this to you because you don't want to read it yourself, I'm sure. If the U.S. is not tracking the situation of women, especially at the household level, how can it expect to have an effective foreign policy? How will it accurately anticipate instability in other countries if it is unaware of linkages related to syndrome components such as bride price and polygyny? How will the U.S. decide which subnational actors are most likely to bring stability in the long term if it is not guided by the Steinem rule that says when various parties within a nation are warring, look to see which one treats women best. They're probably the best bet. How will the U.S. avoid the trap of peace negotiations where the rights of women are bargained away to make peace between warlords if it doesn't understand the linkage between sustainable peace and the empowerment of women? How will it track which of its own greatest internal threat if domestic violence is not taken more seriously? How will it rationally approach immigration policy if it does not comprehend that the true clash of civilizations is not about religion or ethnicity, but about the subordination of women? How will it know that ending child marriage worldwide would do more for world peace than almost any other investment it could make? How will it understand that tolerating enclaves of family and personal status law that subordinate women will destabilize its society? How will it know when exporting democracy makes sense and when it doesn't? We believe one day the idea that foreign policy and national security policy could ignore the situation of women will be seen as laughably naive. And yet I would venture to guess that in national security classes, even here on this campus, this is not a major topic of conversation. All right, so in sum, given the many dimensions examined, it's fair to say that women's insecurity profoundly and significantly undermines state security. And I think Hillary Clinton said it best when she was Secretary of State. The subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and the national security of our country. All right, this is the real realism and the real clash of civilizations. It's not a clash of ethnicity and religion, but a clash of two alternative foundational political orders. One that relies on the syndrome to ensure its security, and which profoundly subjugates women and destabilizes societies in the process, and one that relies on centralized states capable of and willing to accord equal rights in marriage and property to women. Disrupting the weak points of this syndrome may be foundational to cutting the roots of instability, conflict, and ineffective governance. Because when you change that political order, you change everything. This is not a should. This is a could. And I am delighted now to take any questions you might have.
Okay, so we've just heard from Dr. Hudson about the women's peace and security agenda, a lot about the first political order based in patrilineal and fraternal foundations, and how disempowerment at the household level can bring about instability of nations. While many of us here may hold different opinions on certain women's issues, if there's anything I've taken away from today is that these are not just women's issues. These affect everyone in the world, in nations close to us and nations far away. And I think all of us can agree that stability and peace on the national and international scale is a worthy and beneficial goal. Let us take what we learned today and apply it to the many different disciplines we have and are in around campus, and making the priority in our lives the security of the world, which, as Dr. Hudson has shown us, is security and peace of women. Let us actively pursue policy and action that will help us achieve the women in peace and security agenda, as well as the bringing down of the syndrome in the first political order. Thank you so much, Dr. Hudson, for your talk today. It's been very enlightening. We will now turn the time over to Caroline for the Q&A portion.
So for the Q&A portion, we'll probably only be able to take one question due to the interest of time. And I would like to start it with what oppositions have you faced throughout your career that has been surprising to you?
I think probably the most blindsided I ever felt was when Andrea Denbour and I wrote our book about the security consequences of altering sex ratios. And I remember giving our very first paper on that to a professional conference where I was accused of having a secret anti-abortion agenda. And I remember thinking, what? And that was very blindsiding. And I realized then that I was not going to get funding for that kind of research in the United States, because arguing that sex-selective abortion was wrong in the United States is coded as somehow being anti-abortion, and that was too controversial. So funding for our projects came from elsewhere, thank goodness. For example, in India, you were certainly not considered to have an anti-abortion agenda if you believe that sex-selective abortion is wrong. I think we could take another question.
If you'll line up at the microphone, that would make sense.
This is slightly tangential, so you may not want to answer it. But as someone who bases a lot of your ideas and policies that you submit to like the DoD on indices, how do you argue against those, as there's like a resurgence, especially among like the human rights analysis group, that indices are now irrelevant due to the biases of just the methodology within it?
Would you ask that again, because I'm not sure I caught the question.
No, sure. So how do you argue for indices? Because you use indices all the time in WomanStats, and we just saw it right now with the world map. How do you argue that indices are an accurate representation of reality?
Oh, well, if that's a very deep question about ontology. And of course, in WomanStats, we adopt several, I think, important principles. One is complete transparency. There are certain oft-used databases on women that are completely untransparent. So you have no idea why they coded a nation the way that they coded, or who they even consulted, or what data they looked at. So we believe absolutely in transparency. You will see all the data that we use to code that scale, and it will be freely available to you. You're not going to have to search for it. The second principle that we adopt is triangulation. If you read the CEDAW, the report that the nation of North Korea submits on the status of its women every 4 years, you would believe that North Korea was a paradise for women. Well, no, it's not. So it's clear that you have to take multiple sources from multiple types of authority in order to come to a truer picture of what's going on. Right now, we're wrestling with a deep ontological question because we're trying to scale rape prevalence. And the data on rape prevalence stinks, absolutely stinks. And so how do we nuance that? Because currently, right now, the reported rape rate in Sudan is 1/5 that of Sweden. And we don't believe that either. So there are challenges, but I think if you face those challenges head on and straightforwardly, that you can make a case that while nothing is ever an accurate representation of reality besides reality itself, you can come closer than you would otherwise think.
Thank you.
I think we could do one more. Does anyone have a question?
Thanks so much for coming. We're thrilled to read the book when it comes out. So double question one, what's your greatest hope for this next book? And then what do you think will be the greatest criticism that you and your co-authors will receive once it's released?
Oh, I know what the criticism will be. It's silence, right? That's what you do when a woman says something a little bit upsetting. You just pretend she never said it at all. So I don't fear the criticism. I welcome the criticism, because even if somebody thinks we're fools, right, that allows people to say, let's see what she says so that I can determine if she's a fool, right? I like that. I'm okay with that. But silence is what I fear. If you ask me my greatest aspiration, I think it actually stems from something that happened a couple of years ago, which is, you know, in circles of people who like to think that they're intellectuals, there's usually an it book. You don't actually read the book, but you have it on your bedside, right? And you read the reviews of it, so you have sort of a basic understanding of what the argument is, so that when it's raised at cocktail parties, you know, you have to say, oh, yes, I know what you're talking about. And that happened a few years ago to an obscure economist named Thomas Piketty, who wrote this big fat book that I swear nobody I've ever met has read. But they photograph it on their bedstand, right, to show that they've gotten it, right? And his argument was that inequality, economic inequality, is destabilizing. So you needed an 800-page book to prove that. Okay, great. But it's considered to be proved, right? And now people are making policy on the basis of that. So if I had a dream, it would be that I would write an equally opaque I wrote a 783-page book. That's the newest book. And that it will be the next, Piketty-type book, where people will all think they have to at least say that they've read it, they will have to know the argument, and they will have to accept it, right? That women actually matter if you're interested in the security and stability of nations. So that's where I'm at with that. At 3 o'clock, we have a fantastic 2-year master's program, professional master's program in international affairs and in public service and administration at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. It is one of the best bargains you can have. We have the finest faculty, myself included, the finest practitioners, and we are 1/3 the cost of the Georgetowns and the other professional schools of international affairs, because George H.W. Bush realized that none of you could be public servants if you were hamstrung by student debt. So at 3 o'clock in this very room, I'm going to talk more about that graduate program, and I hope you'll come.
Thank you so much to Dr. Hudson, and thank you everyone for coming. Let's give her a hand of applause.